Right.
Timothy Leary was great as an advocate for individual freedom and individual liberty against the system. But he was also portraying psychedelics as somehow or other inherently countercultural, that if you took these drugs, you were always going to be against systems and always an enemy of the state. And if you look historically through thousands of years, most cultures have had an honored place for peoples who alter their consciousness. And
That's right.
for even from our own culture, the Greeks, when we look back at the history of Western thought, the longest running mystery ceremony ever was the Eleusinian Mysteries that ran for almost 2,000 years and ended around 396, squashed by the church.
Yeah.
Because they were more of a direct access to spirituality rather than mediated through a power system.
Right.
But Albert Hoffman and Gordon Wasson and others, Carl Ruck, experts, looked at the Eleusinian Mysteries and found that there was a drink that they consumed called Kikion, and it had rye and barley. And when we look more even closely at it, when you have sort of moisture and kind of a fungus, ergot, grows on rye and barley, and it contains drugs that are very much like LSD.
Right.
So it's from our own tradition, and other traditions like the Native American church use of peyote and the use of mushrooms that go back thousands of years and ayahuasca that goes back a long time, that we're a cultural aberration. And there's reasons for that even too, that our mind, our intellect was squashed by the church, by religion, by fundamentalism. And we see that with Copernicus and Galileo. And there was kind of a truce for 400 or 500 years of religion staying out of science and science staying out of religion. But
Right.
now that's even coming together. So there's tremendous scientific research at Johns Hopkins, at the University of Zurich, elsewhere, where people are looking at lifelong meditators, spiritual leaders, and giving them psychedelics and looking how that impacts them. So we see, I think, that in our current time, with globalization, with religions bumping up against each other, that what we really need, I think, to survive is this sense of what we have in common rather than what we have that's different.
Right.
And under the influence of psychedelics, people can have these unitive mystical experiences that connect us up with, billions of years of history and thousands of years of human evolution. And, and people can understand how intimately connected we are with nature, not separate from it, and how really we're much more similar to even the most different cultural human than we are different.
Rick,
And if we can feel that, and for me, this was confirmed in 1984 when I got in touch with a fellow named Robert Mueller, who was the Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations. And he'd written this book called New Genesis, Shaping a Global Spirituality. And his basic idea was that we have United Nations to mediate disputes between cultures. And if you look more carefully, a lot of those disputes are religious disputes. And we need to get the mystics together to build this sense of alliance and for people to have a global spirituality, which doesn't mean one world religion. It just means that we realize that there's, a whole rainbow of colors, and they're all part of the spectrum, and they're all ways to try to point to something deeper. And we find that, the religions that are more mystically based are more tolerant. And, Stan Grof wanted to go to Israel. I just came back from around 3 weeks in Israel with Stan, where he had talks in Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and Sfat, sort of the mystical center of Israel.
Yes.
And his idea is to eventually to have a conference that would focus on the common mystical roots of the Abrahamic traditions, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, as a way to talk about fundamentalism being replaced by mysticism, and that mysticism is an antidote to fundamentalism.
Our mysticism is almost the fermentation of fundamentalism. It's after some certain amount of time, you get a Rumi or you get these mystics who are taking the fundamental hardcore stuff and converting it into something that's more passionate and juicy and beautiful.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. And so I think that's really the larger vision. So when we talk about MAPS as a nonprofit pharmaceutical company, that's really what we are. That's our strategic approach. That's what I've been trained in through the degree at the Kennedy School and also through my training with Stan Grof. But really, it's about integrating psychedelics and even more beyond that, not just psychedelics, but non-ordinary states of consciousness into our culture, where I think people can have a deeper sense of meaning, a deeper sense of purpose, more tolerance, antidote to prejudice of all sorts. And so I think, given all the crises that we face as a nation, as a culture, as a world, as a planetary species, I think really that psychedelics can play a major role in grounding people into something deeper and helping us really deal with the ways that we're all bumping up against people who are different than ourselves, and see that as a source of pleasure and joy and curiosity rather than as a source of fear and isolationism.
Right. Yeah, that is it's almost like some kind of drought that many cultures are going through, which is a complete lack of access to psychoactive substances that seem to have possibly spawned these religions, spawned the myths, or at least been co-pilots in spawning these ideas. And it feels like a lot of the problems that you're talking about, many of us think that those problems are directly related to removing from the bloodstream of a species chemicals that seem to have been part of the growth of that species, of the subjective growth, or the birth of maybe even the birth of language. Not to get too Terence McKenna level hippie on you, but
well, I think he was onto something, and I think you're right. And I think, though, to sort of talk in a balanced way, though, the irrational is really scary. The beyond rationality. So when we look at people, leaders like Hitler, or leaders like Pol Pot, or others that are able to commit massive genocide, they play on people's unconscious needs and fears, and so there is some wisdom in a sense of trying to, focus on rationality, but it was just a veneer. It's not enough. We have to refine the unconscious. We have to refine the irrational rather than try to turn our backs on it and become. So if we look at what we've done with our modern culture, I mean, we have miraculous technology that has been accomplished. I mean, just the same way that I'm talking to you, that you can do this podcast,
yes,
that people can listen from all over the world. It's just miraculous, and it's the product of our rational mind, but it's not enough. We cannot build a world that turns its back on the irrational and turns its back on the spiritual and just tries to persuade people on the basis of logical arguments. We need to delve deep into the irrational and help refine it. And so that's where one hopes that as time goes by, as generations go down the road here, that we'll be able to use these psychedelic tools to bring the irrational up in safe enough, supportive contexts so that enough people can become more balanced, more grounded, and they can be helpful as the species tries to move forward and not destroy ourselves.